Hello. All right. Part two. Uh, we talked about melancholy a moment ago, and melancholy, if you had to root it in something, is an emotion, right? Moods are emotional. When you're in a bad mood or when you're in a good mood, it's because you are experiencing one or several emotions that make you feel a certain way, and it makes you go up, it makes you come down. Nostalgia is, I think, the definition of a mixed emotion. It has a lot to do with melancholy because sometimes thinking about something you remember makes you both happy but depressed that you're not that happy anymore for a variety of reasons. Most of my concepts, like my intellectual concepts of nostalgia, I can credit to a book called The Future of Nostalgia by a literary theorist and memoirist named Svetlana Boym. I'll send a link to the book. This Everything I'm about to say is a riff off of her main ideas, particularly at the beginning, but it's also a riff on my knowledge of the development of certain concepts in continental Europe and throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. It's again, I'm not an expert in nostalgia, but I know just enough to, I think, be useful to you. So I'd like to package it this way. Uh, so to use Boehm as an example, and then I'll use myself as an example. Boehm, if I remember her book well, having reread parts of it recently, Boehm is someone who has lived with the experience of having to leave parts of the Soviet Union because of the complications that the Russian regime of that age, which survives to a certain extent today, you had to leave certain parts of Eastern Europe because they weren't safe. And it wasn't because you didn't love your home, it was because the government of the day made things so unsafe that it was a choice between leaving your home to an uncertain future or imprisonment, persecution, or death. And there are a lot of people who are members of a diaspora, and I'm convinced Merane has much better things to say about this than I possibly could. Uh, but there are mixed feelings that come from abandoning a home that you love because it is no longer safe or because it is inhospitable to your identity or your sense of self, going to another place where you are safer, but that may not be a culture you recognize or feel comfortable in. So the immigrant experience from top to bottom is loaded with the issues and the problems of nostalgia. So again, Boehm gets into her examples very poignantly. She writes at a very high level. It's Her book is probably difficult to read for those without a graduate level education. I recommend it regardless. I think it would be a wonderful resource, but you might have to throw yourselves at it a little bit. She's quite literary and knows the history of basically the literary history of Europe like the back of her hand. It's a wonderful read for someone like me. Uh, but I think I can illustrate nostalgia through a personal example, one that I understand better as an individual, than one that would be just me abstracting someone else's emotional feelings about certain places. Um, so again, I'm Canadian. I've always lived in Canada. I've spent brief periods of my life outside of Canada. I have not emigrated to another country. However, um, my experience of traveling to and living in Ontario for the better part of a decade, moving from here, the east coast of Canada in New Brunswick, to the central part of Canada, Ontario, even though I never left the country, my experience, while not the same as the immigrant experience, which is far more complicated and traumatic on some levels, resembles it. So I can relate. When Merane would talk to me about Persian culture, I could relate to her description of those experiences because I feel this is an emotional thing that would be hard to prove in fact, but I feel that the culture of New Brunswick is unique. It is approximately the same throughout the Atlantic provinces, by which I mean Newfoundland, Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. But there's something about growing up here that when I went to Ontario and stayed there for as long as I did, I felt profoundly out of place. And that feeling of being out of place is the emotion where nostalgia resides. That's where it lives. And it lives in two ways. Nostalgia is always going in two directions, and Boehm explains this much better than I could, and with terms that I don't think would be incredibly productive for me to try to paraphrase. I'd rather just give a practical example. At the same time, when I lived in Ontario, and when I was studying with Melancholy, your professor, and when I was experiencing the culture of Ontario, which is very different than the one from New Brunswick on a number of levels, which I may or may not have time to explain. I both hated my home province of New Brunswick and idealized it because I missed it. I both ran away from here, where I have returned to, in point of fact. I both idealize my home and I detest it. It's both at once. And both of those things put me into I think, what could fairly be called a melancholic state, depending on what my mood is and what my frame of mind is. So let's split these into two concerns: idealizing the place and hating it. That's the way I'd like to split this. So, from the perspective of when I was living in Ontario, Ontario is a much more populous province. It is a much more economically prosperous province. It is far more diverse. Way more people immigrate through Toronto than almost anywhere else in the country. Again, Montreal and Vancouver are large centers for immigration, but it's very different. A lot of people come into this country through Toronto. Toronto is filled with these beautiful and diverse communities of people from all over the world. And one of the great things about Toronto is that diversity, even though it's stifled by other conditions. So on the one hand, Ontario on paper is a better place for somebody to live. New Brunswick, by comparison, is much less diverse, far less economically prosperous, is essentially run by a single corporation which has full control over the local government. Again, this is a digression. I can't get into it today. But New Brunswick, on paper, is one of the least educated, least prosperous, most impoverished places in Canada. A lot of people my age and from my generation left. And a lot of those folks, especially working class people, went to Alberta and they worked in the oil sands and they worked in the oil industry, among other places. I left, but I chose to come to Ontario instead and to be educated. While I was gone, I would have a lot of thoughts about how much I missed this place. And it wasn't something that I could represent in ways that people would understand. I'll give you a really concrete example. Because of how the weather works, the sunsets and the clouds and the atmosphere of being close to the ocean compared to being landlocked in Ontario, far from the ocean, changes how everything feels. The air is different here. It's colder, it cuts through you in a different way, and the cloudscapes are far more diverse and luminescent. And you go to the beach at sunset, and there's just nothing more beautiful than that I can imagine. And I would miss it. And I didn't realize the things that I would miss the most while I was away from here. And when I returned, or when I would return for holiday vacations or things like that, I would be reminded of how much I missed these things, but they were intangible and there weren't things that I could represent. I would tell people, you have to go there, you have to go to my home to understand what this feels like. And in my memory, when I was feeling sad about being stuck in Ontario, in school, not advancing myself in my personal and professional life, I would idealize these memories of sunsets and cloudscapes and the environment, the way the trees change in the fall, that even though there are lots of trees that change in the autumn in Ontario, there's something about the trees at the Bay of Fundy that's unique that I could only experience when I was here. And I would never get to be here in the fall when this part of the world is easily the most beautiful. And there are people who travel from all over the world just to come to the Bay of Fundy and watch the leaves change because they change here in ways that are unique. The kinds of trees we have and the kinds of flora and fauna we have are unique. And similarly, when I traveled to Germany for a couple of months to pick up the language, or to improve my language, I should say, I would feel nostalgic for Canada, and I would take great pride in telling my European friends from all over the place, and some of them were from outside of Europe. I'd take great pride in explaining to them what made the place special. And they asked me about bears, for instance, which I guess was a Canadian phenomenon to them, but I actually had things to say about them that were unique. So that's the idealized side of things, right? You have memories of the place that you are from that are unique to you and unique to your experience. And those kinds of memories are protected like precious objects. You know, we have keepsakes for loved ones and we have keepsakes of memories. And I have possessions that I have with me still to this day that are representations of these memories. Then there is the hatred. Then as now, um, when I would talk to you about the culture of New Brunswick, not what makes this place special or what makes its people special, but when I'm talking about like the more day-to-day mundanity, New Brunswick has an obsession with resource extraction that makes Alberta seem like just it's a bad example. The Irving Oil Corporation extracts all of the forests, all of the oil. The people here are obsessed with cars. There's almost no public transportation. Um, there are severe discrimination. Uh, there's this passive aggressive discrimination that happens with outsiders. People think New Brunswickers are very nice, but the moment we're talking about people of color, it's a very different kind of conversation that we have to have, and it's uncomfortable. New Brunswick has a lot of problems, and so I would take almost a perverse pleasure in describing to people how messed up this place is. And I still do that. I still talk about New Brunswick in a condescending way because of the severe social issues it has. And I left here because I hated it, because of extenuating personal circumstances, but I left here because I no longer felt safe in my own identity living in this place. I needed to go somewhere else. And again, this is the aspect that is not the same as the immigrant experience, but is similar enough that I can relate where I left here because I felt it was unsafe, though at the first opportunity I also returned. And there are people who travel the world who miss their home and they return to their home if they are able to. And for those who leave parts of the world that are unsafe, they long to return to a safe version of the home that they would never have left had they had another alternative. So there is an emotion that grows out of this that I love this thing that I miss and I hate this thing that I miss. And the gap between them, literally, the gap between a high feeling and a low feeling, the existence of this gap becomes the nostalgia. And the fact that these two things can never be brought together again is the origin of a depressive feeling or a melancholic mood, right? The fact that simultaneously I hate and love my home is something I can't fix. I either accept my home as it is, or I constantly long for it to be what it could be. And so in that gap between reality and expectation, that is actually the kind of thing that creates depression, right? Often the moments where I have struggled the most with my depressive moods has been when I have felt that I am here, that I hate myself, and that what I would need to accomplish or to see in myself to be a good person is way up here. And that gap between self-loathing and idealization, right? That gap is what creates depression. This is more of a personal anecdote. So the mood of nostalgia is a melancholic mood because it's the kind of thing that if you dwell on too long, and if you take yourself out of the present moment for too long, is going to create these very, very serious peaks and valley moments in your own memory, in your own consciousness, in your own cognitive processing, and that's where depressions are born. Um, so ultimately, I think the way that this is addressed to some extent in the Boehm text, the way that nostalgia is managed, not so much overcome, but managed, is finding that middle ground between this ain't great, but it's not as good as I remember. And the gap between self negation and self over idealization is the actual, like realizing what is real, what is actual, what is controllable, what is within the scope of control. Uh, and again, I would encourage Meta maybe to just to cap off what I've contributed here with maybe an example where she could explain the gap between her life in Canada and her life in Iran before she came to Canada. And I remember she would tell me these really poignant anecdotes when we were students together and when we taught together. And I'm sure that she's got any number of them that she can fill in, because the only thing I can provide is an outsider's perspective, because again, I have felt things that are similar to the immigrant experience and to the experience of someone in a diasporic movement, but I haven't lived them myself. So I can only speak in half analogies and half truths and not in proper actualities and real things.